But we'll record this one. All right. Hey, folks, it is March the 30th, and we are continuing on with our lecture over elections. I've updated the notes into Google Classroom, and so it should be like voting notes part 3. And so I'm like building this as we go along. So I want to add one more portion to this to make part 4, which will be the final one. And I'll post that before class on Thursday. All right. So we were talking about who runs elections, and we're talking about these are always people who are from the area who are working at the polls, but there's different ways that they're appointed. So, all right. So now, how are these ballots taken in? Well, of course, we have 3 different ways. Because the ballots in the U.S., hand counting ballots and polling place on election day is not generally feasible. And some of the reasons why they say that is because there are hard set laws on how long it takes to get the ballots counted. Now, of course, legislatures can always extend this, but that's one of the reasons why people make the argument why having hand ballots is hard. The cool thing about hand ballots, however, is that you can recount them easy, and you can make them where they're a little difficult to tamper, and you can have third parties come in and double check a count. So it has its strength. Instead, in almost all jurisdictions, ballots are tabulated electronically, like including like if you vote here, or if you go with your parents when they voted or something like that, or your creepy neighbor, you'll see that they're doing an electronic ballot. And then that electronic ballot will give you a ticket that's supposed to be the paper copy, and they'll print out the paper one. Now, there have been accusations, however, that those could be tampered with, to where you might press a button for President A, but it prints out President B. So everything can be tampered with. You have to watch out. Even back in the days when they were just like counting beans, you could always tamper it, right? So in 2012, there were 3 primary types of voting technology that the voter can use. Paper ballots that are electronically counted, electronic ballots that are electronically tabulated, and electronic ballot marking device. So this is where it's electronic, but it prints out the paper. Now, I need to find it. There's actually, like, y'all heard of like white hat hackers, right?
Yeah.
They're like people who usually do like testing, security testing, and stuff like that for companies. There was one convention, I think I could find it. It was like PBS did a show on it where they had kids go in, and kids like as young as like 12 years old were going in and hacking into electronic voting machines. And some of these kids, it only take them like 5 minutes. They'd be in, they could change all the votes. So they all have their weaknesses, right? They can all be messed with. So it's one of those things. It's one of the reasons why you don't want these things connected to, say, the internet or something like that. Moving on. Parties, campaigns, candidate selection, and winning. Political parties. United States, there are 2 dominant political parties. Now, there's a lot of political parties if you're like willing to like search around. But as far as like the big players that actually hold seats and can win presidencies and stuff like that, well, of course, we have the Democratic Party, which is more center and left, and the Republican Party that is more center and right. Now, I personally don't like left and right because I think that's more of a European convention. It was actually made from the French Revolution. You had something called the Estates Generale, which was kind of like their version of Parliament. And at first, it was made up where the right-hand side of the seating area were pro-monarchist, and the left-hand side were revolutionaries, right? And that I don't think that quite congeals too well with what we're talking about. But for American politics, usually when we're talking about the right, we're talking about people who are more like a conservative mindset. And when we're talking about the left, we're talking more about modern liberal, not classic liberal. Like classic liberal would be like John Locke and stuff like that, but more like modern liberal. So because the U.S. does not have any sort of proportional representation, there are not meaningful third parties in the United States. When third parties do arise, such as in 1992, when we had Ross Perot ran for president. And you can thank Ross Perot. Ross Perot is why we have STAR testing. Yay, thank you, Ross Perot.
Thanks, Ross.
Yay,
Look at
okay.
you.
Yeah, he was actually one of the leaders of the Texas Education Board here in Texas. Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead. One of the two political parties tend to adopt their positions, and the third party fades from interest. Yeah, Ross Perot, both Democrats and Republicans adopted his anti-deficit rhetoric, and his support declined. Additionally, states and non-governmental elected officials often create barriers for third parties to get candidates on the ballot. So, like, for example, some of the barriers. Like the people who run the debates, it's a private organization. But both Democrats and Republicans ensure that other third parties aren't able to enter into the debates, for example. And there's also laws in some states that favor Democrats and Republicans, but kind of make it very difficult for third parties to get onto the ballots. So that's one of the reasons why you don't really see third parties.
At some point.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people who are really mad at both parties. They're like, I don't trust either one here. They might have ideological reasons why they might push towards another.
I don't trust either one of them.
Well, I mean, so yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you're like, one argument is, well, if you vote for a third party, you're always going to lose. And the other argument is, but they're both, you might have cynical reasons, like they're both corrupt and they're both the same thing or something like that, so. But it's for you to figure out. Now, here's like Ross Perot. Yeah, Ross Perot, George W. Bush, no, not George, Herbert Walker Bush Sr. was running for re-election, and he was running against Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas. And Bush was actually in the polls, even though he had some trouble because he raised taxes, was supposed to win. But see, Ross Perot ran on a lot of principles that really attracted a lot of Republicans, like anti-deficit. He was wanting to balance the budget, right? He was wanting to lower people's taxes and also lower the spending of the government. You're like, oh, I like that. And so that tended to move a lot of votes away from Bush. And because Bush lost all those votes, both him and Perot lost, and he had the first term of Bill Clinton. And so this, of course, has happened before with other third parties coming up, where you divide the vote too much, and then you'll have someone you don't expect to become president, like Abraham Lincoln, like that worked in his favor. So sometimes, we saw that happen. That's how Woodrow Wilson became president. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to come in for another term, and so it leaned things towards Wilson's favor. All right, elections. In the U.S., we have a two-part election process. First, political parties hold elections to choose their candidates for the November general election. This is like for the president, right? Like, like when Trump was first nominated, you had like a whole, y'all turn the music off, like a dozen Republicans running for that to be the Republican candidate. And then when Joe Biden here recently was getting nominated, he ran against like another dozen Democrats. And so then the party has to pick who's going to be the party's candidate for presidency. These elections are typically run by local election officials, but are in fact typically considered to be private elections. So that's the thing. Whenever a party is choosing their candidate, there's nothing in the Constitution about that. So that party in those states get to pick however they want to do it. The second, the November general elections have rules that differ for selecting president and selection of other candidates. And this is what we were reading about in the Constitution. So the parties can pick the candidates however they want. But when that candidate is officially running for office, then they have to follow the rules of the land. So let's go to congressional races. Winning and losing congressional races. For congressional races, and for almost all state and local election races, the winning candidate is the voter who receives the most votes. So you could call it the popular vote, bless you. And that's what's normal, right? The presidential election is a little different, as you might remember. So that brings us to congressional districts. So like we saw, y'all are in Texas Congressional District 1. That's the Tyler area. And your congressional person for the House of Representatives is Louis Gohmert, remember? And so every voter only has one representative. That's when I had you do your assignment, who represents me. I told you just look up one congressperson, the one that represents you. Well, you only got one. So congressional district constituencies are established every 10 years. So constituencies. You're a constituent for Louis Gohmert. You're the person he's supposed to represent, even if you voted for him or not. And so these districts are examined after the census is held every 10 years to see that the population and all that stuff pans out. In the first stage of the process, each state is apportioned a number of representatives based on the population. All congressional districts in the U.S. are set to a similar size as possible. So we're trying to divide the United States up according to its population. And so really population dense places might have a lot of representatives within a geographic area. Remember, the Constitution says this. The House is supposed to represent the people. That's why it's divided up based on population, right? Once districts are apportioned to the states, the state legislatures then draw maps for the constituencies within their states. Each constituency has to have the same number of voters, more or less. However, the legislatures can take into account issues such as partisan leaning of voters and drawing district maps. In general, the majority party of the state's legislature attempts to maximize the number of districts in the state. That will maximize the likelihood their party candidates will win election in various congressional districts. Texas just recently won a court case regarding their redistricting. And so the minority party, like the one that's not majority, almost always is going to say something about the district lines. Because whatever party is in charge of that state will try to set the lines up to where it favors them just a little bit by trying to make sure that the population leans more their way in every district as possible. Standard practice. Whether it's right or wrong, that's up to you. But because population is always a constantly changing thing, the lines have to change. So unless you just force people to live in certain segments. So it's a really sticky area, the way the rules are. It brings us to primary elections. Primary election race for Congress, for the U.S. House and the Senate, are races in which all the members of one party run in an election to determine who will be the party's nominee. So, once again, a party chooses their candidate, and then the candidate runs against the other party's candidate. And so that's why it's almost always Democrat-Republican. Now, for smaller elections, you might see people who are running with no party affiliation. That's pretty normal. Like if it's somebody who's going to be like a local sheriff maybe, or a judge, or one of those really small political positions, they might be like, I'm not getting involved with that. I'm just a candidate. I do the job, vote for me, blah, 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 And there's some positions that are you're just basically getting voted in to do a job. So it doesn't really matter what party you're in. You don't have too many decisions to make. The candidate receiving the most votes wins in the election. Remember, each state gets 2 senators. Everybody in that state gets to vote for both of those senators. In some states, if no candidate receives a majority of the voters, 50% plus 1 of all valid votes cast in a primary election, a runoff election is held 2 to 3 weeks later between the 2 candidates. This just recently happened in Georgia. The 2 candidates who placed first and second in the initial rounds of voting. The candidate who receives the majority of votes in round 2 will compete in the general election. So now that was, of course, for primaries, but this actually happened in the regular senatorial race in Georgia just recently. So, oh gosh, it's small text. There are, in generally speaking, 3 kinds of primary elections. Closed primary, where only members who have declared affiliation to a given party can vote in that primary election. So that's like they're saying, who are you going to vote for, like Democrat or Republican? And then you have to register as a Democrat or a Republican. And if you are a registered Republican, you can only vote for a candidate to be chosen for your party. But in some states where you have open primary, you can just vote either way you want to. Like, I've heard people who they always vote for one party, but if they really hate the main candidate in the other party, they'll vote in that primary to try to make that candidate lose. Sometimes people do that. So if you're like, say, you always vote Democrat, but you're like, I really don't like who the Republicans are picking. So you go vote in their primary to have another candidate try to supplant them. It never works. I've never heard of it working, but people do that sometimes. But in general, just try to stick in your own party. All right. Jungle primary, which is used in the states of California, Louisiana, and Washington, have all candidates, regardless of party affiliation, listed. So you can just vote for anyone on that ballot. You'd be like, I'm going to vote for the Republican candidate and the Democrat candidate. Even though in the general election, you might vote for just one. You know what I'm saying? So remember, this isn't the same rules for the primaries as the actual election. So personally, I think you should, I know it's kind of cliche, but you really should look at a person, right? Like look and examine the person and the issues. Sometimes parties get swayed in ways that might be against your beliefs. So you want to be a little careful about tying yourself too close to a political party, because parties change, but your values shouldn't, as long as they're good values. If they're bad values, go ahead and change them. So, all right. Brings us to presidential elections. Then we'll finish the presidential and we'll be done for today. All right. How the Electoral College selects a president. The election for president is a state-by-state election. Remember, Electoral College. Because the president is a candidate who receives the majority of the electoral votes in the Electoral College. So each state gets so many of them, remember? And you can't go to another state and vote for their electors. First, each state has a number of electoral votes equal to the number of U.S. senators in the state plus the number of U.S. House members in the state. So you get two automatically, three actually, because every state gets at least one congressperson. And the rest is based on population, which is also what determines your House membership. For example, Maryland had, this is like 2012, 8 House members and 2 senators. So they had 10 Electoral College votes. Virginia had 11 House members and 2 senators. So they had 13. And so, like the really high population states like Texas and California and New York, we got a lot of Electoral College votes. How the Electoral College selects the president. Second, in almost all states, the candidate who receives the majority of votes in the state receives all the state's Electoral College votes. There are 538 electoral votes in the Electoral College. Therefore, 270 votes are necessary to win the presidency. If no one gets a majority of the votes, the U.S. House of Representatives will break the tie, with each state having a single vote to cast for presidential choice. There was talks of that happening in our most recent one, but it didn't quite make it to that point. It would actually have to take the right combination of states for that to happen, to reach that tie. But selecting presidential candidates. Presidential candidates are selected in a special presidential selection process, similar to the presidential electoral college process. The process of winning the presidential nomination revolves around winning delegates who attend the party's convention and vote for the nomination of that candidate. Each state is allotted a number of delegates. So the states send party representatives, right? So the Republicans will send Republican representatives from Texas to vote on who's going to be the Republican presidential candidate. The Democrats in Texas will send their own delegates to determine who's going to be the Democrat representative or candidate. So each state send those, regardless of what the state has. They have both parties living in the state, right? So the numbers derived from a formula that takes into account the state's population and other factors. but it's pretty much the parties get to pick it. It's not a constitutional thing. It's something the political parties pick out. They get to pick out their own candidates as private entities. There are two types of presidential selection events held to select delegates: a primary election or a caucus. A primary election is essentially just an election. You go to the ballots and you vote for who you want to be your party's candidate. That's it. A caucus is a set of local meetings that are open to all registered members of the party. At the caucus, people are basically like trying to convince one another. I don't think Republicans do this. I think some states, not all states, will let Democrats do this, but pretty much you'll see it'll be like basically like an open basketball stadium, and you'll have like Democrats would have somebody who's for Bernie Sanders here, somebody who is for Kamala Harris here, somebody who's for Biden here, and they're all trying to convince the group of people to go to their side. And whichever group has the most people on their side, then their state's delegates get to choose that candidate, right? So it's kind of like a free-for-all. It's kind of chaotic. Hello. Sure thing. Right. Goodbye, Timothy. We're almost done anyways. So,
He was ready to go.
hey, money in politics. That was the last one. Hey, we're going to come back to that one later. All right, kids. So that's going to end this for today. We're going to come back later, and I think Thursday we're going to finish this up. We're going to talk about money, speaking policies, things like that, and then we'll be done with the voting stuff. All right, see you later. You know, I was